about better scientific understanding of pain and Kripke's rejection of the mind-brain identity theory. So I'm a philosopher, and I was interested if this better scientific understanding of pain that we acquired in the last decades has any bearing on the mind-brain identity theory, which was a very popular theory amongst philosophers in the 50s and then 60s, 1960s. And then Kripke's rejections of this theory. And so I will talk a bit, like this, sorry. So what is the issue? We have this, of course, long problem, the mental, the physical, how to explain this. So, you know, these basic things that humans seem to have physical properties like all the other objects, physical objects like size, weight, shape, color, motion through space and time, but also have these mental properties which involve consciousness like perceptual, emotional experience and intentionality, beliefs, desires, and so on, which are being possessed by a subject or a self. Between these two kinds of properties seem to be this difference. Like the first one is objective, the others are subjective. Physical properties are public, everybody has access to them, while these mental properties are now private. They're only accessible to subject itself, who is experiencing this, has these properties. So, for example, with pain, I can feel my pain, while everybody else can only infer from my behavior that I'm in pain, but cannot feel it themselves, yes? So, now if we take physicalism, the view that the fundamental reality is wholly physical, then we need to explain this mental in physical terms. So now we have different strategies how to tie the mental to the physical. And in the 1950s and 1960s, it was very popular, this mind-brain identity theory, which actually just says that mental states are identical to brain states. So if it takes, again, experience of pain, it is just a brain process and not merely correlated with it. So we have this identity. Now, the philosophers who are defending this view then had to explain now why this, like we have here, they chose this example. They were always saying pain is C fibers firing. This was their identity. So pain is identical to the C fibers firing. Now this mental state is identical to this physical state. But at that time, the most regular idea was that identities are residing here. We have, let's say like this. So pain is C fibers firing. This is not something obvious to everybody, yes? We would not say, yes, of course, pain is C fibers firing. So they said this identity, it's like, for example, lightning is an electrostatic discharge. The fact that this is identical, it's not something that we know a priori in front, because in the meaning of lightning, there is no part in that meaning that lightning is an electrostatic discharge. This is something that scientists discovered, and it's an empirical fact, so it is only known a posteriori. And so the identity theory said we have these contingent identities. No, they are only known after the fact, and because they are contingent, we didn't know about them before, so we have to find out on them, and we don't think that this is really one and the same thing. It's discovered later, no? So two distinct words refer to one thing state, but they could but it is one thing state, but they say this is another positive thing about this view. They think that they could also refer to two different things states in some other circumstances. So for example, if you take this, that in human pain is C fibers firing, if we would have Martians, we could say that pain is some other, it's identical to some other state that is occupying this role. Yes, this would be about contingent identities. In those days, usually when we were talking about necessities, they were only understood linguistically. So we have their bachelors are unmarried men. here identity now between bachelors and unmarried men, it's a fact that we find out solely on the basis of meaning. Now, bachelor is an unmarried man. So here we have these a priori necessities which are based, grounded in meanings of words. So then comes Kripke, which forcefully rejects this idea of contingent identities, and he starts with discussion of proper names. This was in 1970s. He had this lecture in Stanford called Naming a Necessity. So he says proper names are rigid designators, which means that name designates the same object in every possible world. So if it's easier to understand, in every possible circumstance. So if we take now here our Hesperus is phosphorus. Now Hesperus was the name for the brightest star in the evening, while Phosphorus the brightest star in the morning. And later it turned out that actually they are one and the same celestial body, the planet Venus. No? So now Kripke says this is identity which is discovered a posteriori by Babylonian astronomers, it seems. But he says this is not contingent identity but necessary identity, because we are talking about one and the same object, and these two names refer to this same object in all possible worlds or all possible circumstances. So we can't claim that this identity is contingent. It is necessary, because identity is actually about object itself. It's not a relation between two different objects or two different names. It's about the object. And now he says, no, that the same thing which was here about the names, he applies it to theoretical identifications. So he says this lightning, water are natural kind terms, and here it's the same. So if we take water is H2O, he says a reference of water is determined by water's phenomenal properties. So like what it looks like, what it feels, like it's transparent, liquid, colorless, that we find in lakes and rivers. So this would be a way how we identify water or determine the reference of the word water. No? But he says then came the scientists and discovered that its chemical composition it's H2O, so that it's composed of H2O, and this chemical composition is essential for water, for all these stuffs. So in this way, scientists discovered its essence. But because scientists discovered this with experiments, it is a posteriori truth, but it is necessary truth, because this is the essence of water. So in every possible world, water must be H2O. No? While it's not necessarily that it is transparent, liquid, and so on. So its phenomenal properties are not necessary. And now if we apply this to pain is C fibers firing, now Kripke says this is also not contingent identity, no? Because if pain is C fibers firing, now every such identity, if true, is necessary. So they can't have contingent identities. These identity theories, they can also try with that it is really necessary identity. But then we saw that this contingent identity was used so that they could explain why there seems this difference between mental and physical properties, why we don't immediately say, oh yes, pain is C fibers firing. And the same is now with, we have this water is H2O. For example, Kripke says that we also don't see immediately that water is H2O, of course, because this is not this necessity arising from the meaning of the word water and H2O, here the term, but it is discovered a posteriori, and that's why we get this appearance of contingency. So the idea is, because water is identified by its contingent properties, we can miss the fact that it is necessarily composed of H2O, so we get this illusion that it is not necessarily that water is H2O, but in fact it is, after we find out that no, this is the essence of water. And now, if this pain is C fibers firing, it's the same kind of identification. The identity theorists should also be able to explain this seeming appearance of contingency in the same way. No? And then Kripke says, so in the first case, as you saw, we had this thing that water was identified in the world by its phenomenal properties, which were contingent, while we later discovered that it's actually H2O, and this is its essence. So in the case of pain is C fibers firing, it should be the same. Pain should be determined by some phenomenal property, which is accidental property of pain, and then we should, now the scientists discover that is actually essentially C fibers firing. This is true nature of pain. So can identity theorists provide the same explanation? And Kripke says, there is a quote that, of course, he says no. Pain is not picked out by one of its accidental properties, rather it is picked out by the property of being pain itself, by its immediate phenomenological quality. So his idea is that we pick pain by its essential property. This is its immediate phenomenological quality, so this being pain itself. And because we pick it with its essential property, we can't say that there is this appearance of contingency, but later we find out that it's actually identity here present. So the thing is, he says, now if we can imagine a situation in which pain is being felt without a stimulation of C fibers, or we can imagine a situation in which a simulation of C fibers exists without being felt as pain, then this is not only appearance, but it's actually a fact that these are two different things or states in our case. No? So if we can imagine this, then identity thesis must be rejected, and the mind-brain identity theory in this case, in all the other cases, is false. This is his model argument against the mind-brain identity theory. So this is like a bit of a summary. Now, here I have just a very short summary of some scientific findings on pain, which I thought it's relevant for this discussion. So in the 60s until 65, now this prevalent theory at the time was this specificity theory, where pain was understood as an injury-produced response. And the idea was that from the pain receptors, message is conveyed via specialized fibers directly up the spinal cord to the pain center in the brain. So this very simplistic mechanism, so only up. But then in 65, 68, then improved, was introduced this gate control theory, where it was added this gate in the spinal cord, which modulates these noxious stimuli coming up and feelings. And in this process, brain has important role. It's not only stimuli coming up and information. And later also, because of this dissociation effect, it was realized that there has to be this multiple parallel central processing systems involved, so that we don't have only one center, which are selectively associated with sensory discriminative, affective, motivational, and cognitive evaluative aspects of pain experience, so that this pain experience is multi-dimensional. So then we have this definition, which we already heard, that pain is an unpleasant sensory and emotional experience associated with actual or potential tissue damage, or described in terms of such damage. Where I would point out the importance, which was already talked about, that they specifically say then in explanation that pain is psychological state, which can be associated, most of the time is associated with this a physical cause, but that if the patient is telling you that he has a pain and explains it in the way as patients who are in pain with physical cause are saying, then patient is in pain. You can't tell him no, you're not, because I can't find any physical cause of your experience. So then, what would this be? What kind of implication are following from this for the mind-brain identity theory? As we could see, they were talking about pain is C fibers firing. First of all, we saw that there is a complexity of underlying mechanisms and not only one, only C fibers. And of course, the funniest thing that C fibers are not actually in the brain. So if the identity is the identity between the mental state and the brain state, it's a bit funny. So, for example, Nikola Grahek in his book is very upset about this, that he says that this simplistic talk is offensive to science. But I would agree more with the idea that these C fibers that they are using are more stand-in or proxy for whatever the ultimate physical structure is to be identified with pain experience. However, I think that the view that they have on the nature of pain undoubtedly influences what now philosophers take to be plausible and what position they consequently take. So I think that if these identity theories would be aware that this is such a complex mechanism, underlying mechanisms that are present, maybe they would not opt for this identity theory, but they would rather maybe go with the idea that this complexity of mechanisms, that the byproduct of this is this experience of pain, which they have to explain in physical terms, as I mentioned. Now, I will finish also with mentioning of what are the implications of this for Kripke's argument, which was for me more interesting. So he thinks that this sensation of pain is simple, as we saw. He says this, the phenomenological quality of pain is the essence of pain. But we saw that we have these various more aspects of pain, not only like this property. And now if we have, like I put there, these sensory discriminative, affective, emotional, cognitive, evaluative aspects of pain, if you have this, let's say these three, which are all these three essential for pain, as he had only one, this immediate phenomenological property, or maybe it's only one of them essential, or two. So if we go back to his argument, where we were asked to try to imagine, the idea was that to explain this appearance of contingency, we had to imagine that we pick this natural kind, whatever. For example, we had water. You had to pick it with contingent property, and then it had to turn out that it has some essential property, and that's why actually you can't say that that is a contingent, but it's necessary. And here should be the same possibility. Kripke asked us that we should imagine possibility that those two things come apart. And I imagine this situation. Let's say that we identify pain. I mean, I'm not saying this is true, I'm just supposing, by its unpleasantness, so this affective emotional aspect. And that this is only contingent property of pain, that, let's say, sensory discriminative property is essential. So in this case, we could imagine that in some other circumstances, we have C fiber stimulation, so C fibers firing, but this unpleasantness is not present, And then, in this case, we would think that this is in this case, we would determine that that unpleasantness is accidental property, but if this C fiber stimulation is actually essential, then we have here this appearance of contingency, which is the reason why we can say that the pain is not C fiber stimulation. But when we discover, because the pain is picked out by its unpleasantness, but actually we later find out that C fiber stimulation is true nature. Now, this is just supposing things. The same thing is with if we imagine that there is C fiber stimulation occurring, but subject is not experiencing unpleasantness. Now, if we pick in our world, let's say, pain with this unpleasant character, then in this case we would first say, no, this person is not in pain, but if we would told that actually this C fiber stimulation the scientists discovered is the true nature of pain, then we would have to change our mind. So what is a lesson learned here? I think that when Kripke was using his model argument to argue against the mind-brain identity theory, he forgot one important difference between the case of water and the case of pain. In the case of water, science already discovered what is the true nature of water, and so it was possible to determine, and so it could be determined what is possible and what is not concerning water. But in the case of pain, science is still searching for the right answers, so we can't already say this is the true nature of pain. So in that case, we cannot yet determine what is possible and what is not. So he should not actually use this argument in this case. There is this important difference. So if I use his claim that science is discovering essences, then we should wait for its answers now. And the question is what this tells us in general about physical accounts concerning the relationship between the mind and the physics in general, if maybe philosophers should be more careful in proclaiming things about this topic. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, sadly, we went a bit over time, so we only have time for one very